It was an ordinary day at one of the most prestigious academic conferences in America, an event where the country's brightest minds were gathered. Professors from across the nation gathered to showcase their intellectual prowess, but what no one expected was that the real show would come from a young man who was already making waves in the room for a reason no one could ignore: Barron Trump. Now, Barron wasn't just another student attending because of his name, as many assumed. He'd earned his place there with unmatched academic excellence. But none of that mattered when Professor Richard Anderson took the stage. Professor Anderson had a reputation that made many students tremble. He was known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue, a professor who found delight in publicly dismantling traditional values, especially religious ones. He viewed faith as something that belonged to another era, far from the realm of reason and intellect. His lectures were less about teaching and more about showing off, about proving that anyone who still held on to faith was somehow intellectually inferior. As the students filed into the grand lecture hall, there was a palpable buzz in the air. Everyone knew that Professor Anderson was about to deliver one of his usual controversial lectures, but what no one knew was that today, the game was about to change. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Professor Anderson began, folding his arms across his chest as he surveyed the room. It's no secret that studies show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief. In other words, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in God. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze lingering just a little longer on Barron. A smirk tugged at the corners of his lips, as if he already knew where this was going. He clicked a button on the remote, and up came a graph showing IQ versus religious belief. "See this?" he said, pointing to the downward sloping line. "As IQ rises, religious belief falls. Fascinating, isn't it? Yet some of you still cling to these outdated beliefs. Perhaps it's your family traditions," he added with a pointed glance at Barron. The room went silent. Barron didn't flinch. Unlike the other students who shifted uncomfortably or nervously laughed, Barron's expression remained calm and composed. He wasn't going to back down. Professor Anderson leaned in, sensing the opportunity to make a real statement. "Tell me, Barron," he sneered. "What does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they believe in a fairy tale? A god in the sky, an invisible daddy who takes care of everything? It's almost laughable in 2025, don't you think?" The audience tensed, waiting for Barron to respond. But Barron, with all the calm and grace of someone who knew exactly where this was headed, stood up. "Actually, Professor," Barron said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room, "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." He didn't hesitate, didn't stumble. His words were measured, confident. A few students glanced at each other, surprised. They'd expected Barron to either get defensive or back down. Instead, he seemed almost unbothered. Professor Anderson let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Oh, so now you want to teach me about intellectual capacity?" He gestured for Barron to come forward. "Come on then, educate us. Show us how your God fits into the world of quantum mechanics and artificial intelligence. Enlighten us, please." Barron walked calmly to the front of the room. The students were riveted now, their eyes fixed on the unlikely protagonist. Barron, standing tall, looked directly at Anderson. "You claim to be a champion of intellectual discourse," Barron began, his voice steady. "But what I find most interesting is how you've abandoned genuine academic discussion for mockery." He took a step closer, making sure everyone heard every word. "You're so quick to dismiss faith that you refuse to acknowledge the many brilliant minds throughout history who reconciled faith with reason. People like Newton, Planck, Collins, the list goes on." The professor scoffed. "Oh, please," he said dismissively. "Are you seriously suggesting that I should take advice from a man who believed in alchemy?" Barron didn't flinch. "Let's talk about your argument for a moment, Professor. You claim to follow evidence, yet you ignore the research that shows how faith can foster resilience, mental health, and stronger community bonds. Isn't it convenient how you only cite the evidence that supports your position?" The room was silent. Anderson was flustered. Barron was dismantling his arguments with logic and calmness that Anderson had never expected from a student. He tried to regain control, leaning forward and pointing his finger at Barron. "You think that faith in a higher power is intellectually valid? Anderson Street." What next? Are you going to tell us that your God created the universe? Barron's gaze never wavered. Well, Professor, what's more intellectually honest? Admitting that there may be things beyond our current understanding, or arrogantly assuming that we've figured everything out? There was a murmur of approval in the room. The students who had been nervously laughing earlier now nodded along with Barron's points. Anderson's confident smirk was slowly fading. You see, Professor, Barron continued, you're not really angry at God or religion. You're angry at what you perceive to be intellectual weakness. And here's the thing. What you don't realize is that your dismissal of faith is not based on reason. It's based on prejudice. The room was still. Anderson opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face had turned a shade of red that matched his anger, but it was clear. He had lost control of the conversation. Barron's voice remained steady. You mock faith, but what you're really mocking is the idea that there are things beyond your understanding, things that can't be explained through logic alone. And that's not just an intellectual weakness, Professor. That's a failure to acknowledge the mystery and beauty of the universe. There was a long pause as Anderson tried to regroup, but the damage had been done. Barron had just made the most powerful point of the day, and the students who had once been loyal to Anderson's ideology were now quietly reconsidering their positions. Let's talk about your real argument, Barron continued, pressing his advantage. You claim faith is a crutch for the weak. But what's weaker, Professor? Using your academic position to belittle those who disagree with you, or engaging in an honest debate? Anderson's face twisted in frustration. You're twisting my words, he stammered, trying to recover. Science has already explained what religion used to explain. We don't need faith anymore. It's just superstition. Really? Barron replied, his voice cool and unflinching. Then perhaps you can explain consciousness, or the origin of life itself, or why the universe is perfectly fine-tuned for life to exist. Are those just gaps in our knowledge too? Anderson's face fell. He had no answer. Barron smiled slightly. Exactly. You see, Professor, you're so quick to dismiss anything that doesn't fit into your worldview. But that's not science. That's dogma. Your refusal to acknowledge the limits of human understanding is just another form of blind faith. The students, who had once been intimidated by Anderson's reputation, were now looking at Barron with awe. They weren't just witnessing an intellectual battle. They were watching the professor's entire worldview crumble before their eyes. So let me ask you this, Barron said, his voice calm but cutting. Which is more intellectually honest, Professor? Believing in a divine creator, or believing that everything we see, the complexity of life, the beauty of the universe, just happened by accident? The room was still, and this time, Anderson had no response. Professor Anderson stood there, staring at Barron, his mouth open in disbelief. The audience waited for the professor to recover, but it was clear. He had lost this battle. His reputation, built on years of mocking faith, had been shattered in a matter of minutes. As the class ended, the students filed out of the room, their whispers echoing through the hall. Did you see that? Barron Trump just completely shut down Professor Anderson. The buzz was electric. Even those who had once sided with Anderson were now questioning everything they'd been taught. Barron didn't gloat. He didn't bask in his victory. Instead, he walked out of the room quietly, his head held high. He had done what no one thought possible. He had defeated intellectual arrogance with intellectual honesty. And as Professor Anderson stood at the front of the room, staring at his notes, he realized something crucial. The true intellectual giants are those who remain open-minded, those who are willing to challenge their own beliefs. And today, Barron Trump had proven that.